Larry, we're back now with another session of what is just unequivocally becoming an historic citizens' grand jury. We're going to have more expert testimony today from some of the most prominent experts in this field. Take it away, Larry.
Let's do a little recap. We're in our 11th session of our citizens' grand jury, and we were always ahead of the curve. As we began this process many, many months ago, having indicted Robert Mueller for trying to suborn perjury with my client, Dr. Jerome Corsi, to implicate the president in Russian collusion crimes. We moved on to Joe Biden, to Hunter Biden, and James Biden. This spring, we've indicted them. They'll be getting notice shortly that they'll be tried. And of course, we indicted Mitch McConnell, who, much like the Bidens, was taking bribes under the table from China laundered through his wife, Elaine Chao. And now, of course, we're focusing on Dr. Fauci, and we're seeking his indictment as well. We're continuing to take testimony because new charges arise virtually every minute. Yesterday, there were emails that were released. We're going to talk about that ironically BuzzFeed got, which is unusual, you know, an ultra-leftist rag of the left, but I guess they were curious as to what was going on, probably wanted to implicate Trump in something about this. But here's the bottom line, and I'm going to turn it over to Judy very quickly, Dr. Judy Mikovits, who's been out there for a very long time saying everything that now is being said today in large part. And there's a lot more that needs to be said, and we're going to recap that. But one of the things that I want to make clear, and we're going to be playing a video before we get to Judy Mikovits, Dr. Mikovits, of Mike Pompeo this morning on Fox and Friends. You know, Fox has rediscovered this issue. In the beginning, they wouldn't discuss it, but now they need to get back their conservative viewers, so they're willing to discuss it. I mean, they are the WHORs that they are, but let's give them credit at least now that they're trying to boost their ratings again. But this is something that's been buried. And Judy and I have been on other networks, and those segments were pulled at the time when the left complained. The left never wanted to implicate communist China in producing an engineered COVID-19 bioweapon, because to them, that's their mecca. I mean, Mao is a hero to the left and what came after him in communist China. But let's play right now, because this tells you something, and watch it for this basis, because there's going to be other indictments coming down, is that the fact that it is now coming out that COVID-19 was engineered, that it was sent over by Fauci for analysis, for testing in the Wuhan lab, the fact that it is a bioweapon, this has all been known by the US government, even during the days of Donald Trump. We have an NSA. We have a CIA, and you're going to see Mike Pompeo, who was head of the CIA, and he's going to be asked a question. Did you know about this earlier? And he won't answer the question. He gives you a lot of gibberish, saying, well, it may be classified. Well, all he has to do is say, I know it's been engineered. I know it's a bioweapon. He doesn't have to in any way disclose sources and methods, which is his excuse. But as much as the left and as much as the Biden-Harris administration is now being vilified, the hard fact is that during the reign of Donald Trump, the deep state in our intelligence agencies knew this and kept it from the American people, just like they're keeping from us many of the aspects of the harmful effects of the vaccines that are now being administered. So let's roll the videotape, so to speak, and then we'll turn it over to Dr. Judy Mikovits to expound on what she's been saying for a year. Let's recap it. And she's also going to go forward on a PowerPoint demonstration of other things that she needs to bring to our attention, and then other matters as may arise in the course of this grand jury testimony. But let's play this clip of Mike Pompeo, and you're going to see just how dishonest our government is, both Democrat and Republican.
All right, let's bring in Mike Pompeo, Fox News contributor, former Secretary of State. Good morning to you.
Good morning. Good morning to you all.
We'll start with your reaction on Dr. Fauci and everything that's coming out with him lately. He had his first interview with Nicole Wallace yesterday, and she really didn't grill him about those emails. What's your reaction about these 3,200 pages of emails that BuzzFeed got?
So I've seen some of the emails. What really matters here is when it mattered most, when the Chinese were covering this up in early January of 2020, Dr. Fauci certainly would have seen the same intelligence that I saw. We would certainly have known that the risk that this came from the laboratory was real. We would have known that the Chinese Communist Party didn't want any of us to know that, and that raised red flags throughout the entire United States government for far too long. Dr. Fauci let those of us who are out there talking about it carry the mantle, and we couldn't get science. We got politics instead, and that's what you saw in the left-wing media. You saw politics trumping science, and that delayed our capacity to respond to what the Chinese Communist Party foisted upon the world.
Directly affects our national security. Here's an example of some of the emails that I think are eyebrow-raising. This is an email to Dr. Peter Daszak. This is what he's responding after Anthony Fauci sidelined the talk of a lab leak. Quote, April 18th, 2020. I'm sure you remember this. I just want to say a personal thank you on behalf of our staff and collaborators for publicly standing up and stating that the scientific evidence supports a natural origin from COVID-19 from a bat to a human spillover, not a lab release from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. From my perspective, your comments are brave, and coming from your trusted voice will help dispel the myths being spun around the virus's origins. Now, your job, Secretary of State, knowing that that was going on behind the scenes, Anthony Fauci saying it happened by happenstance, wet market, as opposed to a Wuhan lab, where Tom Cotton was one of the first to say, let's look at that lab.
Yeah, so Senator Cotton got it right after that email that you described in early May. I began to talk about this as well. We knew that the evidence was accumulating, it was piling up, showing that the theory of the wet market didn't hold water, and that the much more likely scenario was that this had come from the virology lab in Wuhan. And this guy Daszak, the fellow that wrote this email, he's got dirty hands. He was involved in this laboratory. There was taxpayer money that was funneled through an alliance that he was responsible for. You know, too, Brian, he was one of the lead investigators that was sent in to take a look at this.
What a joke.
There's a lot of questions to be answered. I think Dr. Fauci has a lot of questions to answer, and this matters. Your point, Brian, about this being about American national security. That lab is still operating. That work is still going on there today, and we could have something like this happen again, and the Chinese Communist Party refuses to tell us what they know. The United States, President Biden must demand that we get these answers, and we need to know how the U.S. government, Dr. Fauci, Daszak, all the folks that were involved in underwriting this laboratory, what they knew, when they knew it, because this will help us answer the important questions that will keep us all safe.
Okay, that's the perfect segue to the question I have for you, Mr. Secretary. You've always been a straight shooter. We know there were some behind-the-scenes scuffles between the president and Fauci and you guys. Did y'all know something was going on behind the scenes, that there was this connection back then? What did you guys know at the time?
So I have to be a little careful. You saw, Lawrence, what we were able to release on January 15th. Director Ratcliffe, the head of the DNI at the time, and I had been working for an awfully long time to get as much information released as we possibly could. We knew we could watch all the facts begin to align that suggested that the most likely case. We knew about the doctors. We watched them disappear. Journalists. We knew that people had taken ill in Wuhan. We began to see this evidence accumulate. We were trying to get it out. We were certainly trying to make sure everybody in the United States government knew,
Mr. Secretary,
so we could respond.
Sorry to interrupt. What prevented you guys from pushing it out, all the information?
Yeah, it's a complicated process, Lawrence said. There's still more information that's sitting there that I think ought to be out, but you have sources and methods, intelligence things that need to be protected. I was a director of the CIA. I understand that. But we need to make sure that the American people know everything that we can. And then, frankly, we don't know the answer for sure. We need the Chinese Communist Party to be held accountable.
Will we ever know the answer, the origins of this virus that killed millions of people around the world?
Yeah, I think we will. It may take years and years and years. We know it has already taken too long. The Chinese Communist Party could answer this in 30 seconds if they chose to do so. But I think one day we'll know. Some brave Chinese doctor, some technician will break free, and they'll share the information. We'll be able to validate what happened. We need to get the answer to this question.
Right. I will say this, just in terms of what emails subscribe to what you're saying, this exchange between a scientist, Richard Henderson, to Fauci, he said, unusual features on the virus make up a really small part of the genome, so one has to look at very hard at all the sequences to see that some of the features potentially look engineered. Isn't that nice? So that might have been manufactured and made.
Larry, I have one correction to what Secretary Pompeo said. The first person to speak about this was actually Dr. Judy Mikovits.
Well, that's right, Jason. And if you can excuse the French, this is total bullshit. Let me repeat that. Bullshit. It's clear that he knows. Pompeo knew, director of the CIA, Secretary of State from the start. Oh, he can't release it because of sources and methods. Then he says, well, maybe we'll know in years. Well, we have total worldwide surveillance. We have satellite communications and intercepts. We knew from the beginning. President Trump knew from the beginning. As much as we like President Trump, he kept it from the American people as well, undoubtedly, because they didn't want to start something with China. Instead, you know, he called the Chinese names, Kung Flu, this or that. And that was my criticism at the time. And we offered to have Dr. Mikovits meet with the president. The people in and around Trump didn't accept our invitation in that regard. And if you can find this, I want to show.
Absolutely. And I want to reiterate to our viewers and potential participants in the Third Continental Congress, Larry, as you said, the fundraising effort here is not about making money, but everything that we do costs money. So getting the space and all that, we rely on we the people to support it. So I hope that people will visit freedomwatchusa.org and join us in Philadelphia. We've got some additional expert testimony. Where would we like to go now, Larry?
Yes, let's go to John Cullen. I'd like John to introduce himself, who he is, also a true patriot who's not afraid to tell the truth and has taken some very important investigative stands on things. So John, why don't you weigh in on this? And we'll begin it this week and we'll hear much more from you next week.
Thank you, Larry. It's great to be here. Real honor. Thank you. Hi, Dr. Judy. Good to see you.
Good to see you, John.
And hey, Kent. Good to hear you. I don't see you, but I hear you, Kent. And it's nice to know you're out there.
I never get to see you, John.
You can see me now, right? You can see me,
You're
right?
wearing those glasses.
Oh, well, that's as good. That's as good as
He's
it's
got a
going to
tie
get.
on. This is the formal John Cullen.
Exactly. This is my grand jury outfit, Larry. I hope
You've sent
you
me a
noticed.
bunch of information and some links, John. Where would you like me to begin?
Let's begin with the PDF file, and then the PDF file will tell us when we're going to go to a video or something. There we go. All right. So by means of introduction to the grand jury, a little over 30 years ago, I worked at Oracle, and I was the program manager that put together the mapping system that Johns Hopkins has been using to track the coronavirus. That's my software. I built it. And early on during the outbreak, just using the map, this is the Johns Hopkins official map, I noticed that there weren't 10 people dead in Beijing. And so my testimony is going to build on the foundational testimony of Dr. Mikovits, Kent and Lively. This is data to support their testimony. So everything I've heard from Dr. Judy and from Kent is supported by the data that you're about to see. My observations, my career background, I'm a quantitative analyst. So I look at data and I make data easier to understand quickly. And I've been using the CDC's website to do it. And so the first observations that made me dig into this deeper was that the Johns Hopkins reports were telling us that there weren't 50 people dead in Vietnam. And so I started to think more deeply about what I heard Dr. Judy say about how the virus itself, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and the sickness that we're seeing in the hospitals may not, has that connection been made? So I started to dig in deeper. What I found was at the CDC's website, the United States was going through a dramatic influenza outbreak. In fact, beginning the first week, the first week of January of 2020, 4,000 people a week were dying in the United States from what's called PNI, pneumonia and influenza. And this was unprecedented. We've never saw anything like this before. And this is before coronavirus shows up. And so I was a bit taken aback. And I said, well, wait a second. Then what happened? This looks like the worst outbreak of influenza we've ever seen. And in fact, it was. What the data shows is that the 2019-2020 influenza season in the United States, according to the CDC, was the worst in history. So the question is, can two viruses spread at the same time? Why not? Right? Could people have coronavirus and herpes? Sure. Why not? Right? Could some people have coronavirus and some people have influenza? Sure. Why not? We know what the influenza outbreak looked like before coronavirus arrived. Let's go to the next slide. So what you're looking at here is the CDC's mortality data. So this is different than the upfront surveillance. This is people who died. And what we see here, this goes all the way back to October 2016 to the present day, right? And this is direct from the CDC. And what you see is on the right-hand side, it's much bigger than it's ever been. Now let's go down to the next page. Let's keep going down. All right, I sent you a Time Magazine link. This is I think there's a link to this video. And this is Time Magazine in January of 2020 telling us this is the worst influenza season the CDC has ever seen. And Dr. Fauci told us 80,000 people died in 2017. So that would mean this is even worse. So this is Time Magazine. This was published in January of 2020. And I'd like to enter this into evidence, Mr. Klayman, if possible. This is Time Magazine telling us this is the worst influenza season the United States has ever seen.
Yes, it is put before the grand jury. Actually, you don't need evidence in a grand jury, John. But it's more than sufficient because it doesn't constitute evidence. You've just authenticated it, so it's even stronger than what you need to obtain indictments. Thank you.
And people can check that video, John. I'll post a link in the description afterward, but in the interest of time, I'm going to allow you to continue with your presentation.
All right. So Time Magazine and many other major media outlets tell us that we're in the midst of the worst flu season we've ever seen. And this is January 2020. The CDC mortality data is showing us 4,000 people a week are dying every week, January, February, March, 4,000 a week. Unprecedented. Let's go to the next page. So this is what the season looks like. And what we're tracking, or what I started to track, was both influenza and coronavirus simultaneously. Because before there was coronavirus, there was influenza. And as coronavirus arrives in the United States, the question is, did influenza just disappear or no? So what you see here in this chart is the number of people who've died each week from each affliction. Blue is influenza, green is coronavirus. And by week 12, we see coronavirus is starting to make an appearance as far as deaths, but we've had 4,000 people a week dying from influenza before coronavirus even arrives. Okay. Now, let's go to the next slide and see what happens. The question is, did coronavirus just completely push influenza out and influenza just stopped when coronavirus arrived? Or is that not what happened? And by tracking both outbreaks, at the CDC's mortality system, we go to the next slide. Fauci tells us the coronavirus pushed the flu out. Can we play that Brett Baer video clip that I think I sent you?
Yep. Apologies. That was right there. That Time magazine. Do you have that there?
No, Brett Baer with Fauci. It was in the WeTransfer download.
Oh, got it. So many different pieces of media here. No, I don't have that. Sorry. He tells him, we got no influenza. As I recall, Anthony Fauci is recounting a phone call with colleagues in Australia.
I have the audio. I can play the audio.
Play it.
I have the audio. Okay.
Yep.
You know, because of what we're doing with coronavirus, we haven't heard a lot about the seasonal flu. We lose 30 to 60,000 people from the flu. Has that gone down dramatically?
Extraordinarily dramatically, Brett. And in fact, that is a very good testimony to the efficacy of wearing masks, avoiding congregate settings, and keeping distance, because we did that during this late fall, early winter. And the level of influenza in the community is remarkably low regarding comparisons to other years. Our Australian colleagues had the same experience during their winter, which is essentially our summer. When I was talking to my colleagues in Australia, they were saying, Tony, we don't have hardly any flu this year, and we think it's due to the fact that people are wearing masks, keeping their distance, and avoiding congregate settings. Goes to show you that those types of public health measures actually work.
The problem,
Dr. Fauci, we appreciate your time and welcome back.
The problem with that is that the data from the coroners doesn't support what Dr. Fauci just said. So if we go to the next slide, the issue is I'm referencing the CDC's website that shows us mortality. And when we look at the mortality data, I want to step the jury through week by week what happened. As coronavirus appears, if you go down where it's blue and green, you're going to see week to week the arrival of coronavirus versus influenza deaths. Every week from week 1, there's 4,000 people dying. Okay, now we get to week 12 and 13, and what we see is that coronavirus deaths are starting to catch up to influenza deaths in week 13. If we go to the next slide, what you'll see is that there you go. So now coronavirus deaths are almost equal to influenza deaths, but influenza has not disappeared. Influenza is taking off, as is coronavirus. Now, one of the things we're going to look at in a moment is the comorbidity factor. One of the issues in the United States is the United States is using comorbidities with coronavirus. So if somebody dies with cancer and coronavirus, we'll talk about how that's counted. It's not until this slide where we see coronavirus deaths start to eclipse the influenza deaths. The issue is, again, influenza is still higher than it was the week earlier. It hasn't gone away. It's still getting bigger, but coronavirus got bigger faster. Now, this same little time window here where we're watching coronavirus take over from influenza as far as the number of deaths is this week 11, 12, 13, 14 time frame, which we're going to come back to in a moment. Let's go to the next slide if we can. Okay, so now we see influenza starting to come down off of its peak, and we see coronavirus continuing to go higher. What that means is we're seeing two distinct different outbreaks with two distinct different behavior patterns, not double counting. We have an influenza outbreak that we heard from Time magazine a moment ago was the worst we've ever seen, with 4,000 people a week dying. But then I guess it's week, week 13, more than 6,000 die. Then in week 14, right? More than 6,000 people die from influenza in week 13. In week 14, more than 10,000 die. And in week 15, more than 12,000 people die from P&I in the United States. But the story now is all about coronavirus. Okay, let's go to the next slide if we can. So what you're seeing now is basically the two outbreaks happening simultaneously. One that started much earlier and one that came on strong. But if you go to the next slide, what we're going to start to explore now is the comorbidity factor here. This is what it looks like up until the present day. And what you see is that in the shape of the outbreaks are very similar. And in the valleys, there are weeks where influenza deaths are outnumbering coronavirus deaths. So the question is, why would the CDC, why would Dr. Fauci not want to tell everybody about this influenza outbreak that they were talking about in January? Why wouldn't they want to talk about it? And why does it seem like maybe he's fine talking about Wuhan and gain of function with coronavirus rather than talking about gain of function with the Spanish flu? Because what this outbreak appears to be is the worst influenza outbreak since the Spanish flu in the United States. 274,000 people died in the 2019-2020 season. And you haven't heard a whisper about it because of coronavirus or because of which strain of influenza this might be. There is a strain of influenza that was reconstructed by Dr. Fauci and Dr. Taubenberger. And this goes back to the testimony of Dr. Mikovits. Dr. Mikovits says this is bigger than Dr. Fauci. There's more people involved here. Jeffrey Taubenberger was the one who resurrected or reconstructed the Spanish flu from Breivik Mission, Alaska. But it was Dr. Yoshihiro Kawaoka from the University of Wisconsin that did the gain of function on it. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Can we go to the next slide? All right, so this is influenza and coronavirus, neck and neck. And if you look at the data up on top, Jason, if you zoom into the heading on the top there, total COVID deaths, 205,000. Total influenza deaths, 274,000. So when Kent Hickenlively says Dr. Fauci is not an honest guy, there's something called lies of omission, which is where you don't tell people something that's kind of important, like 4,000 people a week died of influenza every single week in 2020. This has never happened historically. I have the data to show this to the jury. This has never happened. So given that there are antiviral treatments like the one that Timothy Cunningham was championing, Xofluza. Timothy Cunningham said Xofluza is borderline a miracle drug. Why are we spending so much time and energy on vaccines? Xofluza is one tablet, one pill that treats H1N1. One dose, one pill, one tablet from Genentech. They must not be part of the inside circle. Let's go to the next slide if we can. What is the number one comorbidity of coronavirus deaths? So of people, of the 600,000 Americans that have died with coronavirus, what is the number one comorbidity? According to the CDC, it's on the next slide. And it's influenza. More than half of the people that died with coronavirus had influenza. But we just heard Dr. Fauci say there was no influenza with Brett Baer. But the data, according to the coroners, says something different. So again, this is the CDC's website that I'm using to get this data from. right? And this is just math. I'm not interpreting it. Just one is bigger than the other, right? So people with influenza and people that don't have influenza, there's not much interpretation here. All right, let's go to the next slide. All right, so then as a data analyst, what I started to do was look at the different groups by age and see by age category, were more people dying with influenza or without influenza with COVID? And it seemed that in every single age category, can you zoom into that legend, Jason, in the middle of that slide there, which shows us what blue and green are? Yeah. So one is deaths with COVID and pneumonia with and without influenza, right? So one has no influenza and one is everybody else. So the blue are people that do not have influenza and the green are the people that do. And what you see is there's a lot of people that have influenza with COVID, but nobody talked about that. Now, the reason this is important is there is no FDA approved therapeutic treatment for coronavirus that the WHO has authorized. Yet there is for the influenza. When we look at children under 1 year, 1 to 4 and 5 to 14, most of the kids that died with coronavirus, according to the CDC, also had influenza. Most of them, way more than 50%. Yet, were they treated therapeutically with antivirals? Let's go to the next slide. We get to comorbidities. In the comorbidity section on the CDC's website, what they explain is that 5% of the big number are people who died just with SARS-CoV-2. The remaining 95% of the people had on average 4 comorbidities. So if you have an average of 4, well, that means there's a bunch of people that have got 7 and 8 comorbidities, right? So these are things like cancer, Alzheimer's, right? Other terminal conditions. But what we look at is what's the number one comorbidity? Influenza. Influenza P&I by far is the number one comorbidity according to. Now, the question then is, why would they not tell us about this second affliction? Because if it's an evil one, you know, when Dr. Judy, I think, is just scratching the surface and, you know, not telling us, you know, when you talk about USAMRID, right? When you talk about the stuff done at Fort Detrick, this particular 1918 strain is the deadliest virus on the planet. And they've been doing gain of function research on it at University of Wisconsin. No wonder Fauci wants everybody talking about Wuhan, because he doesn't want them talking about Taubenberger. He doesn't want them talking about Kawaoka and the reconstruction of the deadliest virus on earth. He wants you talking about China. Blame it on China. Blame it on the bats. Keep looking in Wuhan. This has, so here's why we come back to the maps. Why are the maps relevant? Because there aren't 10 people dead in Beijing. Because there aren't 10 people dead in Shanghai, because there aren't 250 people dead in Hong Kong. And for the last 10 weeks in the United States, more people have died from influenza than from COVID. And not only has Fauci not told you this, neither has Anderson Cooper, Rachel Maddow, Sean Hannity, David Muir. Why is this the fact that more people have died every week for the last 10 weeks in the United States from pneumonia and influenza than from coronavirus? And this is straight from the CDC. The reason must be that the strain of influenza points right back to Walter Reed and Taubenberger and Fauci, and it's got his fingerprint on it. The minute you saw that, Dr. Mikovits, if I showed you the 1918 H1 strain, how long would it take you to figure out, oh my God, is this what I'm looking at? Right? I mean, would it take you an hour? Would it take you 45 minutes, 20 minutes?
No,
How long would it take you as an expert to figure out what you're looking at? Oh my God, this is, where did you guys find this?
right.
How long would it take you? How long
John,
would
this
that take
is
you?
brilliant analysis. Let's get to Judy's comment on it.
And you actually showed it to me when we talked, John. I believe it was last September. And I pulled the paper by a guy named Reed, and the paper's doing this research. And they literally exhumed the bodies of people who died and cloned out the pathogenic part in 2005. They've been doing it all along. And when we talked last September, you showed me this paper, and I've been saying this since then. This is why they're cremating the body, so you will think it's that monkey virus that never was in humans and you cloned. And what did you also do? Read the book by John M. Barry, The Great Influenza. Oh, you know, that book reads like prophecy, just like our book, Plague of Corruption. Yeah, you put them in a mask and you destroy their immune system. And then you add a vaccine program. The flu vaccine drove COVID and the mask. And we've known it all along. And this is what Professor Luc Montagnier said last September as well. The risk is...
We have Dr. Fauci on video telling us that the influenza vaccine is at best 30 to 40% effective against influenza going into this 2020 season that they said was the worst season in history. So he tells us it's ineffective, right? I mean, if you got your stuff right 30% of the time, you get fired, right? Most jobs, if you get it right 30% of the time, you get fired. All right, so we come back to comorbidities because when I look at other countries like Vietnam, this is important for the jury to understand. The population of Vietnam is larger than Germany. It's larger than the UK. It's larger than France. There's 100 million people in Vietnam, and there aren't 50 dead. Thailand has a larger population than France. Thailand doesn't have 1,500 people dead. France has over 100,000. So I look at hang on, stay on the comorbidity factor for a second. This is important. So what the CDC is telling us is that 5% of the 600,000 died just with SARS-CoV-2. Now, Dr. Judy, you've been saying for a year, I'm not certain that the SARS-CoV-2 virus is causing this horrific thing that I'm seeing people with the lungs falling apart into jelly. I'm not convinced that's that. Well, guess what? The CDC is telling us, well, 28,834 of the people died just with SARS-CoV-2. All these other people either have influenza, Alzheimer's, cancer, some other affliction, and many of them have 4 of them. So if we take this 28,800, go to the next page, Jason. If we go to the next slide, I wanted to put this in perspective. And so what we see here, this is the different causes of death in the United States ranked. And what we see is that the number of people who fall down, if you go down to the middle of the page, the number of people in the United States that simply fall down and die is 39,443. More people are dying falling down than died from SARS-CoV-2, according to the CDC. Now, if I were a lawyer, I might say I rest my case, but I'm not. I have more. Okay, but more people have
before
died
you go there, look,
falling down than from SARS-CoV-2 directly.
John, before you go there, let me ask you this. Is what you're saying, you made reference to gain of function research at the University of Wisconsin, that they were monkeying around, no pun intended, in Wisconsin, okay, playing around with this gain of function on this particular strain of influenza, the Spanish flu, and it got out from that monkeying around in Wisconsin, and Fauci and the rest of them were behind it.
Almost. The data shows, so yes, the gain of function is being done in Wisconsin by this Dr. Kawaoka, but the data from the WHO that I'm going to show the grand jury in a second here, the data from the WHO,
World Health Organization,
the World Health Organization, shows an outbreak of influenza in 2019 in the summer that is astounding. The worst influenza outbreak in Australia's history in the last 100 years happens in the summer of 2019. And those athletes potentially go to Wuhan. And somebody figures out, somebody who's like a Dr. Judy in China figures out, oh, that's Fauci's virus. That's the Spanish flu. And it goes through Wuhan and tears through Wuhan. But here's a fact that I am certain the grand jury is not aware of. There are fewer people dead in China than Iowa. There are fewer people dead in China today than Kansas.
Well, according to their statistics.
According to Johns Hopkins and the CDC and the WHO. Now, China could be lying, but then that takes us to Vietnam and Thailand and Laos and Cambodia and Australia, right? So if there's more people dead in Rhode Island than the entire continent of Australia, and Dr. Fauci didn't think this was relevant, he didn't think it was, in other words, he's speaking in front of the Senate about Wuhan, and there aren't 10 people dead in Beijing, and that doesn't come up.
Well, let me ask you this question. Okay, maybe I'm missing something.
Yes.
How did it get out? Where did it come from? How did it get out?
Okay, so we know that there's only a certain number of BSL-4 laboratories.
And Judy can respond to that as well.
All right, so there's 11 of them in the United States. But again, I'm simply going by data. So if you're going to ask me where do I believe it came from based on the data indicates it started in the Southern Hemisphere in the summer of 2019 and spread around the world. And because we had 4,000 people dying of this virus in January, the question to Dr. Fauci is, Dr. Fauci, you either knew this was happening and chose not to tell us, or you were unaware of it, which makes you negligent. How can you be unaware of 4,000 people a week dying of influenza January, February, March, and then comes coronavirus?
Well, apart, John, and I want Judy to answer this, apart from not disclosing what went on, and of course you're right, omitting material facts are as dishonest as telling false facts. Is there anything to suggest that it escaped as a result of anything Fauci and his cronies did? That's what I'm going to ask Judy. Okay, did they play any role in the release of this deadly Spanish flu virus?
Absolutely. They shipped the cell lines around the world in those little vials to all the facilities, and then you have infection by injection in the flu vaccine. So we know the vaccine given in January of 19 to the Italians was grown in Maiden Derby kidney cell, the dog cell line. So it doesn't take much to recombine every day. They knew exactly what they were doing. And then again, the masks drove the Spanish flu. Just, they knew how to ignite that fire, how to throw the flame in the fire.
Does Fauci or any of the others have any financial interest in these flu vaccines? And the same question with regard to the COVID vaccines. Who has financial interest other than Big Pharma that may be involved in government regulation or universities or elsewhere that have an interest in promoting the flu vaccine and the COVID vaccine?
Yes, the CDC. The CDC makes most of its money mandating these vaccines around the world. That's why the last slide I showed you was how to end this by, closing those doors and stopping that advisory council on immunization practices. So
Taubenberger wants to develop a universal vaccine that protects against the pandemic strain that he resurrected. It's like the movie Mission Impossible, where you have Chimera and Bellerophon. He resurrected the virus, and now he's on a 15-year mission to come up with a vaccine against the thing he resurrected. This is Jeffrey Taubenberger. But again, in the news today, the news cycles about Peter Daszak Wuhan, SARS-CoV-2, and gain of function. That is the smokescreen. The deadliest virus on Earth is H1N1 from Breivik Mission, Alaska, from the permafrost that Jeffrey Taubenberger resurrected. But Dr. Kawaoka at University of Wisconsin, and Jason, you can pull up an article in the Independent. If you type Independent, Dr. Kawaoka, Kawaoka, actually it's in my presentation at the end. This article explains, and Google fellow Ray Kurzweil, fellow at Google, came out and wrote an editorial in the New York Times with Bill Joy, the founder of Sun, and said, what are these guys doing? You can't do this. You can't resurrect the deadliest virus on Earth. And it turns out Kawaoka's lab is BSL-2. I think my dentist's office is BSL-2, right?
What's
so
BSL-2?
Biosafety level 2, and importantly, when those deadly cancer mouse viruses were spreading around, they said unintended escape of a biosafety level 2 variant or virus. And again, you grow the virus in the cell line. They carry them in their pockets. I used to do that. Take the vial, it's in liquid nitrogen. You're carrying it's not an unintended release. They ship them around the world so everybody else can study.
And they talk about it. They talk about it openly. They say one of their biggest fears is that the stuff they work on comes out on the fabric of somebody who is working on it. They tell you that's their biggest fear, is somebody takes their work home with them. Judy, probably heard it every week, I'm sure.
That's
but,
Jason, who died, our families. That's who got infected, the lab workers. Why did Melinda Gates say, oh, let's just get the healthcare workers? It's called nosocomial spread. Half my lab, half my friends are dead. Thank God I worked in a biosafety level 3 with HIV.
Do we have another moment, Larry, or to show a little
sure.
bit more evidence?
And we're going to pick it up next week too. But I guess what we're seeing here, to put in layman's terms, as I say sometimes Klayman's terms, is a much bigger scandal here, for lack of a better word.
And it's about to get bigger.
And it shows the pattern and practice and the potential for future pandemics, which now apparently we've got 2 going parallel. Okay. An interesting observation. I won't name the name of my doctor. He's a very fine doctor, high level. He was telling me at the time period that all these hospitalizations were occurring, that it was not unusual that there were no hospital beds, that every single year, as a result of influenza, the same amount of hospital beds were being occupied. And it was a misstatement. And he's left of center, by the way. It was a misstatement to be saying that it was all due to COVID-19. So that tends to support, just in a general sense, what you're saying, John, is that we have 2 pandemics that are going on at the same time. One which is unaddressed,
right?
And then therefore we need to delve deeper into Fauci's culpability and other people's culpability for that. And why are they now focusing more on China, first trying to deny it, but now the facts are coming out about their own involvement as well.
You got it. Exactly right. China and Wuhan, the honest truth is that is the distraction. And I couldn't understand, why wouldn't they just tell people, hey, listen, we've got 2 things going on. You have to get tested. And if you have this, the medicine is this. And if you have that, the medicine is that. What was so wrong with that? Why would they just shut up about one of the viruses? And the reason goes back to this 2005 resurrection by Taubenberger and the fact that the United States resurrected it. And what Dr. Judy said is, yes, we shipped it around the world, but we also published the genome on GenBank. And what that means is that Iran, a gene sequencer, if you have a gene sequencing machine, it just has 4 ingredients, just like a printer. It's like, yellow, magenta, cyan, and black. A gene sequencer just has adenine, guanine, tryptosine, right? It's just 4 ingredients to make DNA. And you tell it what you want, and you come back 19 hours later, and you got a little thing of that. Well, we published it. We published it on GenBank, which means Iran has it, China has it, everybody has it. Well, you don't need a vial from Fauci. You just need to go to GenBank, type it in and enter it into your sequencer and come back in 21 hours and you got a little bit of stuff right there. Yeah. That's how it works. So it's in the public domain. Jason, if we have 5 more minutes, I want to show the rest of 1 or 2 of these slides I had in that deck, if we can.
Sure.
Where would you like to go, John?
A little bit up. I don't think we got to this yet. Up. Okay, flu burden. Next slide. All right, the CDC, and this is something that when Dr. Judy and I first met, we talked about this, and this was something Dr. Judy said, yes, I know about this. So Dr. Judy, I'm going to ask you to add some color commentary here. After the 2009 H1N1 outbreak that supposedly only killed 12,000 people in America, it was declared a global pandemic, but only 12,000 people died. After that, the CDC came up with something called influenza burden. And influenza burden was a complex calculation. The report that we have from the 2019-2020 season that I just showed you, the calculation in the mortality system shows 274,000 people died. So why would this system show us 22,000? Because influenza burden is different from how many people died. Influenza burden is a complex calculation that Dr. Judy educated me on and said, oh yeah, they came up with this right after 2009. And this is a complex formula that I'm going to show you in a second. But Jason, if you can go up, maybe half a dozen slides up. Yeah. Up. Okay, stop there. Up, go back down. That's a little too far. A little further down, one more. All right, we talked about more people were falling down than died just of SARS-CoV-2. And let's go to the next slide. So the next slide, so the number of people who died with SARS-CoV-2 with no other comorbidity versus fall. Okay, next slide. And here we go. All right, so Larry, you just said that this seems to be bigger than we expected. This is bigger than just SARS-CoV-2 and COVID and Wuhan. And the answer is, I believe that to be true. When we're talking about why would this virus just create such weird behavior, why would nobody want to talk about it? If you zoom out, Jason, I published this paper in October, right after Dr. Judy was on the show, I think. And what I noticed was there was a paper from the CDC saying there's no influenza in the United States, Australia, Chile, and South Africa. But Jason and I, on my show, had been looking at other countries in Europe using this very system. And so I was like, yeah, but what about Bulgaria? What about Austria? What about Switzerland? What about Sweden? What about Norway? Why did you guys stop at just 4 countries? So if you go to the next slide, Jason, what the jury is going to see here is that the World Health Organization basically said that influenza stopped in week 11 globally. It just stopped. Now, we're talking about the deadliest virus potentially on Earth, and the number of people who were dying was dramatic, and then it just stops. This is the World Health Organization now. This isn't the CDC. So when you want to talk about subterfuge, how do you get all these countries to just stop with influenza at the same time? How does this happen? This was a coincidence that I found to be remarkable, so I wrote a paper about it. And there's a saying in chess, there's a play in chess called the Queen's Gambit, which is where you sacrifice your queen knowingly in order to lull or draw your opponent into a bad play. And so my paper came to the conclusion that influenza must have been eradicated from Earth like smallpox. Must be gone. Must be, right? There's no data. We don't see it anywhere, so it must be gone. And then Fauci comes on and tells Brett Baer, yes, it's gone. And then the Associated Press picks up the story the day after I published the paper and says, yes, it's gone. Can you zoom out and show everybody that that's the Associated Press says amid the COVID-19 pandemic, flu has disappeared in the USA. And the day after Dr. Judy came on the show with us, actually 48 hours later, CBS published a paper saying that any comparisons between COVID-19 and the Spanish flu are dangerous. Now, who the hell was making that comparison other than Dr. Judy and I in September? And the article came out less than 48 hours later, basically saying this is conspiracy bunk. And we were talking about lung tissue damage. We're talking about cytokine storms and similarities in afflictions. How is this? We're just having adult conversations as educated adults.
If I may weigh in here, I had to laugh a little bit because the other thing that's gone is AP's building in Gaza. I guess that's no longer in existence either. But that's neither here nor there.
Right? Indeed.
Housing Hamas. I mean, this is the integrity of Associated Press and the rest of the left.
Indeed. Well,
they want to shut it all down. Yeah, they worship at the altar of government, and they worship at the altar of Fauci.
The evidence of that, I believe, is the fact that you have not heard that there aren't 10 people dead in Beijing. There aren't 10 people dead in Shanghai. There aren't 250 dead in Hong Kong. And yet America's been sold this story that this is the China virus that came from Wuhan. There's more people dead in Iowa than China. There's more people dead in Kansas than Korea. How did that happen? Why did that happen? Was this a cover-up for a different virus that had somebody's fingerprints on it?
We don't want to diminish. I know you're not trying to do this, John. We're not diminishing the impact of COVID-19. What we're saying is that is substantial. It's big. It's harmful. It's destructive. But there's something else out there. There's something else out there that is even more destructive that we're not being told about. And the answer is why. And we have to get to the bottom of it. And who is responsible for resurrecting a more deadly virus? And as far as Fauci is concerned, what was his role in either helping it be resurrected or covering up? And what's the profit motive? Because that's what it all revolves around in doing it.
Imagine Fauci has two pets, a pit bull that's very poorly behaved and bites people, and a grizzly bear that's even worse. He doesn't want you talking about the grizzly bear right now. He wants all attention on his pit bull because he's got a grizzly bear that's mauling everybody, and he does not want you to know about it. Let's go back to that chart, Jason, because I want to show people the difference between the influenza P&I deaths and the 5%, which is the real number of people. So in other words, if you wanted to compare the United States population to a place like Malaysia, you would get a fair comparison if you look at that 5% number. So let's go back to that chart, Jason. So let's go past the next slide. Yeah. So this is this definition of influenza burden. It's very complicated. Can the audience see this? This is the influenza burden definition. And this is very complex. A lot of authors. It's not how many people died. It's hospital beds divided by utilization minus how many bedpans you use in a 24-hour period. And did you or did you not want the special meal? It's a complex formula. And one of the things in the formula is how many people died. Well, that's all I want to know about. I don't care about the beds and the bed sheets and how many bedpans are. I'm not in that business. Can we go to the next slide, Jason? I see Larry, not the slides. Is there a way for me to see the slide?
I think that's controlled on.
Okay, I see it now. There I go. I got it. Okay, let's keep going. So this is influenza burden and the complex definition of it, as opposed to how many people died from flu. So when you hear 22,000, it's this. This is 22,000. 274,000 is when we go to the spreadsheet and just add it up. That's how many people died. So here you see the pyramid. The top of the pyramid is how many people died. The formula is some complex ratio of hospitalizations, symptomatic illnesses, adjusted rates of hospitalizations, This is nonsense. And I challenge Dr. Walensky to show me exactly how she gets to 22,000 from 274,000. Show me the math. Show me the math. How did we get from 274 P&I deaths to 22,000 influenza burden using your formula, using your pyramid.
And one could also say, show me the money, because that's what's behind most likely
Well,
the entire scandal.
I'm just going to keep it to the math. I'm going to stick to the evidence and no inferences. I don't want to suggest anybody did anything untoward. I just want to stick to the math. So let's go to the next. Jason, I want to see this slide again. I do that. All right. So the other thing that we do know, Dr. Judy, is that the only therapeutic treatment for coronavirus has been Remdesivir, which is strange because the FDA didn't approve Remdesivir for Ebola, which is what it was designed for in the first place. And it never really made a whole lot of sense. Well, why would we go to an Ebola drug to treat coronavirus? Why wouldn't we check with, mumps or chickenpox? Or why would you even think the Ebola vaccine or the Ebola treatment?
Let's cut it at this point, and we're going to pick it up next week, John, because we're going over 2 hours, and we want to maintain the attention of the grand jurors. But let Judy answer your question on that, and then we'll conclude it for today, and we'll pick it up, hopefully, with all of us next week, because this is an evolving story, to put it mildly, and we need to get to the bottom of this as well. It's very important what you just presented, John, in a very detailed and very professional way.
Oh, thank you.
Judy, if you can comment on this. Judy may not be there.
Yeah.
Oh, she's there.
Yeah, I am here. I killed my computer. I'm just not, it's amazing. Yes, Remdesivir for Ebola, and it goes to the heart of what I was saying before, because these things have been spread in the vaccines, for decades. So they're both there, and it's cover up and kind of murder. And this is why Remdesivir wasn't working. So I just got to think about it for a week or so, because I'm just dumbfounded listening to this right now.
Yeah, the WHO doesn't recommend it. The WHO says, no, Remdesivir doesn't work. Right. They don't recommend it at all. So it's the only thing the FDA has approved. Yeah, so it wasn't approved for Ebola.
That tells you what I said about corruption.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why I said I believe my testimony would build on Dr. Judy's testimony and just fill it in.
Let's just say as a general rule, and getting a little bit beyond this legal proceeding in terms of seeking indictments, but it's why the American people need to take everything with more than a grain of salt, is that they can't take things hook, line, and sinker. As Ronald Reagan said, the scariest words in the English language are, "Hi, I'm here from the government and here to help you." They're not here to help you, believe me. They're here to feather their own nest, to line their own pockets, and to acquire more power. And that's why we need to declare independence again. It's much worse today than it was on July 4th, 1776. The powers that this government has control of are much greater than King George III had. And I was always saying, when I joined the NSA back in 2014 and 2015 for mass surveillance, that if King George III had an NSA, our founding fathers would have never made their way to Philadelphia. They would have been picked up, arrested, and executed before they got there. And indeed, today we have the FBI being used as Gestapo by Biden and Harris out in the countryside, rounding people up. Already 450 people have been arrested. Many have been convicted simply for going, in large part, to support President Trump on July 6th. This is what we're dealing with, and this is why the Citizens Grand Jury is so important. So let Dr. Judy think about that for a week. We'll reconvene next week, same time, same place, same station. And in the meantime, I thank our grand jurors. We will be augmenting the indictment that we're going to be putting forward based on a lot of this new information. And I'm going to also be including counts with regard to the deaths of the people that have occurred, negligent homicide, and perhaps even greater than that. So we will be building the record. And thank God that Dr. Judy and Kent and you, John, all have, whether people are willing to recognize it or not, a tremendous degree of credibility, because what you have been saying has proven to be true. You've now proven it, John, with statistics, Judy with her expertise, knowledge, and experience, and knowing these people, knowing how they operate, and with her own life experience, contracting deadly viruses, and also with regard to the fact that our own so-called Justice Department. And this is one aspect of what we're going to be putting forth to the Third Continental Congress. You can go to freedomwatchusa.org and be part of that. All of our participants will be part of that. But we need an independent Justice Department separated from the executive branch of government and from the legislative and from the judicial branch. So it's no longer influenced by politics. And if we had that, you wouldn't need citizens' grand juries. But we don't have that. And what we've got right now is a compromised and corrupt Justice Department and FBI that do the bidding of the political hacks that run this country. That's my final word for today. Jason, you want to close it out?
Larry, I want to thank you and your team at Freedom Watch, because we would not be having this citizens grand jury without your efforts. And our viewers and people around the internet and around the world can support your team at Freedom Watch by going to freedomwatchusa.org and tapping on the donate button. I think patriots are going to want to join us in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, July 5th and 6th later this year. Sign up now and make your tax-deductible contribution of $150 so we can see everyone in Philadelphia. I also want to thank Larry, our just really fantastic expert witnesses today, each of which has presented extremely compelling evidence and testimony. I want to remind viewers that they can support Dr. Mikovits and Kent Heckenlively by purchasing their book. You can pre-order Plague of Corruption now, and there are several books that they've released. So even if you can't read, buy these books, support Dr. Judy and Kent. And I mean, this is an incredible fight. It's just shocking to hear what Dr. Judy has been subjected to. And certainly if the founding fathers were attempting to do this, their bank accounts would have been seized on the way. So Dr. Judy has endured a hellish resistance. And finally, I want to remind our viewers that they can subscribe to the John E. Hoover YouTube channel by just searching for John E. Hoover on YouTube. Larry, John's research has brought him under attack. He's been spoofed. So people want to make sure they're signing up for the proper John E. Hoover YouTube channel. 38,000 subscribers at the time of this broadcast. I also want to let people know that they can see John each Friday on his sponsor-exclusive show on Crowdsource the Truth. They can become sponsors and watch John's show by going to subscribestar.com/IamJohnCullen or patreon.com/IamJohnCullen. And people can support this program and Crowdsource the Truth by going to subscribestar.com or patreon.com/Crowdsource the Truth. I want to thank all of the sponsors that make these broadcasts possible. We are under increasing pressure from YouTube and outside sources who don't want you to hear this information. So please, in order for this news to be by the people, for the people, and of the people, we rely on your support and sponsorship. So please become a sponsor today. Thanks, everybody, for watching. We'll see you next week for another session of the Citizens Grand Jury.
Thank you, Jason. God bless to everybody. Let us pray that this country will be saved.